Okay, so a couple of weeks ago, we looked at Sartre's analysis of bad faith, and central to the analysis of bad faith was the interrelation between being for itself, which is consciousness, and being in itself, which is the world. Now, in order to get to grips more fully with the phenomenon of bad faith, therefore, we need to look in more detail at the structure of consciousness and its relationship to the world and its relationship to itself. So what I want to focus on this week is on Sartre's account of consciousness. Now, as we'll see, Sartre's account of consciousness often sounds vaguely paradoxical because his concern is with the way in which consciousness fails to coincide with itself. And the failure to recognise this failure to coincide with itself is what leads to many of the errors of traditional metaphysics. And it's also responsible for the pessimistic picture of human reality that Sartre develops. So today I want to go through the sections in the following order. First of all, I want to look at Sartre's account of consciousness itself. And second, I want to turn to his account of facticity. Now, given Sartre's focus on consciousness, we need to understand how consciousness relates to the world. Now, clearly there are features of our existence we can't change, such as where we're born, but nonetheless, our relationship to facts such as these is complicated. So these facts might be fixed, but the meaning of those facts isn't fixed, since it's us who determines the meaning of them. So it's consciousness, essentially, that determines how we relate to the world, even if we always find ourselves within a given situation. So that naturally opens out onto the question of what it is for something to be possible for us. Now, in the case of both value and of possibility, Sartre is going to make the similar claim to the claim he made in terms of nothingness. So value and possibility come into existence with the emergence of consciousness, just like nothingness does, but their foundation in human existence doesn't mean that they're not to be seen as objective phenomena. So just as nothingness is both founded in our own expectations, but also as objective, value and possibility, similarly, are objective phenomena that are grounded in our own existence. They wouldn't exist without us. Okay. So as I said, Sartre begins the section with the discussion of the nature of consciousness. And his opening claim is that neither Descartes nor Husserl nor Heidegger have properly given an account of the nature of consciousness. So today, and for this course, I want to leave aside really the accounts of Husserl and Heidegger that Sartre gives, and I want to focus on the claims he makes against Descartes, just because I know you'll all be familiar with Descartes. Now, Sartre's issue essentially with Descartes is that Descartes begins by recognising the importance of consciousness when he formulates the cogito argument. So, the central argument of Descartes' thought is the I think, therefore I am. So he recognises the importance of consciousness, but he doesn't properly analyse what consciousness is. And so he ends up seeing consciousness as a substance. So what Descartes leaves out of his account of consciousness is the fact that consciousness is always intentional. That is, it's always understood as a process of relating to an object. Now that means that consciousness can't be understood as something like a substance, because substance is something that can be understood in abstraction from other things, and consciousness can only be understood in terms of it being a relation to things. So I'll talk about Sartre's view of consciousness in a sec by itself, but as a way of getting to grips with what Sartre is talking about in terms of consciousness, I think it's interesting to contrast it with the other form of existence that plays a key role in being a nothingness, and that's being in itself. So consciousness is loosely understood to be what Sartre calls being for itself, but there's this other form of existence called being in itself, which is the other primary category of stuff in being and nothingness. Now, being in itself is essentially the kind of existence that things have. Now, Sartre's claim is going to be that the central feature of consciousness is that it does not coincide with itself in a full equivalence. So it doesn't coincide with itself. Now, I'll come back to what that means a bit later, but we can note for now that things we find in the world do coincide with themselves. So a thing, for instance, this pen, simply is what it is. There's an absolute coincidence of itself with itself, and there's no other dimension to it. A pen cannot escape itself in the same way that I can escape myself in the manner we looked at in Bad Faith last week. So here's Sartre's description of being in itself, so the way that things exist. Such equivalence, which is that of the in itself, is expressed by a simple formula. Being is what it is. A is A means that A exists in an infinite compression with an infinite density. Identity is the limiting concept of unification. It is not true that the in itself has any need of a synthetic unification of its being. At its extreme limit, unity disappears and passes into identity. Identity is the ideal of one, and one comes into the world by human reality. The in itself is full of itself, and no more total plenitude can be imagined, no more perfect equivalence of content to the container. There is not the slightest emptiness in being, not the tiniest crack through which nothingness might slip in. So things just are what they are. Absolute identity. Now, if things are what they are in this way, if there's no gap within the nature of things, why doesn't consciousness coincide with itself in the same way? Well, the answer is going to be that consciousness has an ambivalent relationship both with itself, but also with the world outside of it. So when we talk about consciousness, and we've covered this a little bit over the past few weeks, there are at least two different ways in which we can talk about being conscious of ourselves. And one of these ways is the way that you find in Descartes. So one of the ways we can be conscious of ourselves is by consciousness reflecting on its own nature. Now, Descartes claims that we're not conscious of ourselves all the time, and we need to reflect on our own nature in order to validate our existence. So, it's only when we think, I think, therefore I am, that we can be truly certain of our existence. Now, Sartre's claim is that aside from that explicit reflective consciousness that we find in Descartes, we have an implicit consciousness even when we're fully engaged in or preoccupied with the world. So Sartre gives the following example of counting a packet of cigarettes. In other words, every positional consciousness of an object is at the same time a non-positional consciousness of itself. If I count the cigarettes which are in that case, I have an impression of disclosing an objective property of this collection of cigarettes. They are a dozen. This property appears to my consciousness as a property existing in the world. It's very possible that I have no positional consciousness of counting them. Then I do not know myself as counting. Proof of this is that children who are capable of making an addition spontaneously cannot explain how they subsequently set about it. Yet, the moment that these cigarettes are revealed to me as a dozen, I have a non-thetic consciousness of my adding activity. If anyone questioned me, indeed if anyone should ask, "What are you doing there?" I should reply at once, "I am counting." This reply aims not only at the instantaneous consciousness which I can achieve by reflection, but at those fleeting consciousnesses which have passed by without being reflected on, which are forever not reflected on in my immediate past. Thus, reflection has no kind of primacy over the consciousness reflected on. It is not reflection that reveals consciousness reflected onto itself. Quite the contrary. It is the non-reflective consciousness that renders reflection possible. There is a pre-reflective cogito that is a condition of the Cartesian cogito. Okay, so that's obviously got a complicated picture. And you can see this account that there are two moments, two ways of consciousness relating to itself forming. So what can we take from this? Well, the first thing we see is we see consciousness engaged with objects. So the object in this case is the case of cigarettes that's being counted. Now, on the one hand, therefore, we see consciousness in this case as purely the object is engaged with. Consciousness is purely the object that's in front of it. We're purely engaged in what we're doing. So this is like we looked at earlier, the idea of the tram as the tram that has to be caught in order for us to get to work. There's no consciousness of ourselves, there's pure engagement with the world. We can note, second, that consciousness doesn't entirely coincide with what it's relating to, even when it's entirely preoccupied with the world in this way. Now that's clear not only from the moment we're asked what we're doing, so the moment you say, well, what are you doing? You say, I'm counting these cigarettes. But also from the fact that we don't simply have to relate to the cigarettes from a position of counting. We could also desire the cigarettes, we could be curious about them, we could relate to the cigarette with a feeling of disgust or nausea if we smoke too many. So consciousness of objects doesn't require the idea of a complete collapse into objects themselves. But there's a necessary gap between the object and... In order for us to be conscious of objects in such a way that we can recognise that we're not simply the object themselves, there has to be a gap between us and the object, between consciousness and the object. And that gap makes possible the fact that we can relate to the object in all sorts of different ways. Okay, so that's the second mode, and that's the pre-reflective cogito. So alongside the act of counting, there's a kind of tacit awareness of the act of counting itself. Now, third, when we're asked what we're doing and we reply that we're counting the cigarettes, we've become aware of ourselves in two separate ways. First, we're aware of ourselves as reflecting on our own consciousness, much in the way that Descartes talks about it in the Meditations. So consciousness becomes an object for itself. But we're also aware of ourselves in our activity without consciousness becoming an object for itself. So, I mean, one way of thinking about this is the way in which, if you're doing something like dancing, there's an awareness of the fact that you're dancing that goes alongside with the activity. But that awareness is very different from the idea that if you fully reflect on yourself, or the awareness you get when you fully reflect on yourself, because that second purely reflective activity, in fact, means quite often that you, in your reflection, you lose your proper engagement with dancing and you lose a sense of rhythm. So there's a difference between the tacit awareness that you're dancing and the full reflection on the activity that, in a sense, draws you out of the activity itself and makes consciousness an object for itself. Okay, so when we consider these points carefully, we can see why consciousness differs from the in itself. So consciousness simply doesn't coincide with itself in the way that objects coincide with themselves. So let's take, for example, my beliefs. Now, on the one hand, when I consider my beliefs from the point of view of what consciousness is totally its beliefs. So consciousness of belief appears to coincide with belief. But as we've seen, consciousness doesn't simply coincide with its object, however. The whatness of consciousness and belief will be simply belief, but consciousness also has an awareness of itself as the kind of translucent relationship to this belief. So it achieves this by annihilating or introducing a space of nothingness between itself and its belief. So when we believe something, we have that consciousness of our belief, but we also have a consciousness that we are in a state of believing. So consciousness of belief fails to entirely coincide with itself. So if we try and reflect on our consciousness of belief as consciousness of belief, we find the two terms again don't coincide. If we make our consciousness of belief an object of consciousness, then in fact we've got two very different kinds of consciousness. Because when consciousness reflects on its own nature, rather than coinciding with itself, we find on the one hand the consciousness that's reflected on as the consciousness it's related to, and on the other hand we find the consciousness that's relating to it. So if I reflect on my mental states, rather than coinciding with those states, in a sense, reflection becomes a relation to those mental states as if they were an object, and so we get a split within consciousness. So I know that's really hard, and we'll go through that in the seminars. I think we can get a bit clearer about it by remembering that consciousness is a relation to an object. So that means on the one hand that consciousness is not itself an object, but on the other it means that what it relates to, it's going to treat as an object or a subject matter or a content. So when consciousness reflects on itself, it falsifies its own nature by reifying it as an object for consciousness. So when we reflect on what we're doing, we often disrupt the action itself. And that's because reflection kills the easy relationship of engagement to the world we have when we're not thinking about what we're doing. Because it takes that process of engagement and turns it into an object for reflection. And by doing so, it puts a sort of space between that consciousness as an object and its activities. So, like I said, this is quite hard stuff. We can go over it again in the seminars. But if we look at a philosopher like Descartes, or Hegel, if you've looked at Hegel, we'll find that for them, the fundamental feature of consciousness is it's able to be present to itself. So the fundamental basis of what Descartes does, for instance, the basis of his philosophical system, is the fact that we recognise ourselves as a thinking thing. So when he says, "I think, therefore I am," he makes the assumption that consciousness is entirely transparent to itself. Now, as Sartre notes, being present to ourselves doesn't involve something like being aware of ourselves as a substance. Consciousness is present to itself as precisely not being one with itself. So on the one hand, we're engaged in the world, and our presence to ourselves is simply a tacit awareness of the fact that we're drawing together our experiences into a coherent world. And then when we reflect on this process, the unity of ourselves collapses and a distance opens up between consciousness as reflection and consciousness reflected on. Okay, lots of consciousnesses. Okay, so like I say, I'm happy to talk more about that in the seminars because it's really important for what Sartre's doing, but it is hard. Okay, so the second topic that Sartre considers is facticity. So by facticity, Sartre means those aspects of our lives that are, in a sense, beyond our control, such as where we're born, how tall we are, whether we're good at certain activities or not. And Sartre's claim is that these features of our lives are entirely contingent. So we don't choose them, and there's no ultimate reason why the situation we find ourselves in is structured in one way rather than another. So Sartre notes that we tend to try and cover over this facticity about our lives. So the key example he gives is Descartes' proof for the existence of God. So in the third meditation, Descartes argues that our idea of God that we have can't come from ourselves, since we're finite beings. Now, Descartes argues that the only origin of such an idea can be God himself. So that's the proof for the existence of God. The trademark argument. I have an idea, I'm a finite being, the idea is infinite, therefore it has to come from elsewhere and it has to come from God. Now, Sartre argues that Descartes here is in bad faith. So Descartes' insight is that we're not the foundation of our own existence. That's the key claim of the meditations at that point, that we're contingent beings, we're not self-causing beings. Now, the bad faith comes when he argues that because we're contingent, there must be a necessary foundation for our being, and that's God. Now, what Sartre notes is that while consciousness might not be the foundation of its own being, it is the foundation of its own nothingness. So Sartre uses this fact to extend his analysis beyond the simple fact of the contingency of the being for itself. So what Sartre suggests, and it's only a suggestion for reasons we can talk about in the seminars, is that the origin of consciousness is in being in itself. So consciousness arises for Sartre because matter attempts to found itself by negating itself as matter and becoming consciousness. So the idea he discusses is that in becoming conscious of itself, being in itself aims to provide a foundation that allows it to escape from its own contingency. In a word, being is and can only be, but the peculiar possibility of being, that which is revealed in the annihilating act, is being the foundation of itself as consciousness through the sacrificial act which annihilates being. The for itself is the in itself, losing itself as in itself in order to found itself as consciousness. So the fact that that consciousness arises from a position in the field of contingency explains why we always find ourselves in a particular situation. So insofar as consciousness emerges from a given situation, it's able to provide some kind of justification for what it is. It can reason and it can explain why the particular situation is the way it is. So consciousness appears to offer the possibility of the in itself becoming a foundation for itself. So in effect, what Sartre is arguing is that once consciousness comes into the world, when matter becomes conscious, it's the whole notion of justification becomes possible. And so that brings with it the possibility of the in itself becoming a foundation for itself. Whereas prior to consciousness, those concepts don't exist. So in fact, however, whenever we reflect on ourselves in relating to our situation, what we recognise is that our own being is separated from ourselves. So when I feel angry, for instance, then this anger appears to be grounded in my conscious feeling of anger. But as soon as I reflect on the nature of my anger, I realise its contingency. So the facticity of my existence gives meaning to my life, and I emerge in a particular situation, but this meaning is never final and is always contingent. So in that I fail to give some kind of foundation to my situation, it remains contingent, and I find myself in a position of both taking my responsibility for my situation whilst knowing that that situation is contingent. So what that means is that I'm forced to take up responsibility for where I am in the world, for the situation I've been given. But I'm also aware that that situation is one that's purely contingent. So if, for instance, I feel myself to be angry, as in Sartre's example, then as soon as I reflect on that anger, I realise that the anger is a position that could be otherwise. As soon as I recognise that I'm feeling angry, then there's the possibility of giving up that anger. So, in a sense, I'm both responsible for who I am, but ultimately who I am arises from the contingencies of the world around me. Now, what that means is that facticity expresses a kind of limited, compromised freedom. And Sartre expresses this fact as follows. We indicated earlier that we can be nothing without playing at it. If I'm a cafe waiter, we said this can be only in the mode of not being one. And this is true. If I could be a waiter, I should suddenly constitute myself as a contingent block of identity, and I'm not that. This contingent being in itself always escapes me, but in order that I may freely give a meaning to the obligations which my state involves, then in one sense, at the heart of the for itself, as a perpetual, evanescent totality, being in itself must be given as the evanescent contingency of my situation. This is a result of the fact that while I must play at being a waiter in order to be one, still it would be vain for me to play at being a diplomat or a sailor, for I would not be one. This inapprehensible fact of my condition, this impalpable difference which distinguishes this drama of realization from drama pure and simple, is what causes the for itself, while choosing the meaning of its situation, and while constituting itself as the foundation of itself in situation, not to choose its position. So that's facticity. I have to take up my own situation, and I give meaning to that situation, so I'm responsible for it. But it's also the case that that situation is fundamentally contingent. So while I'm responsible for my relation to my position as a waiter and how I take up and respond to that situation, it's still the case that that situation is utterly contingent and not chosen by me, to the extent that while I can play at being a waiter, I can't play at being a diplomat or a sailor, because my situation just doesn't entail that. Okay. So section 3 deepens our understanding of consciousness. So we've already seen that Sartre identifies consciousness with nothingness. And here what he does is he makes the further claim that consciousness is a lack. Now this lack is in turn going to be the foundation of value in the world. So as with nothingness, Sartre's claim is going to be that lack isn't something that simply rests on the surface of language, but is something that's fundamental to the nature of things. So the parallel, therefore, is with the example of Pierre not being in the cafe. Pierre is not in the cafe in a way that differs from Wellington not being in the cafe, for instance, because the absence of seeing Pierre in the cafe organises the rest of the cafe. It gives meaning to the scene, whereas the absence of Wellington in the cafe doesn't organise the cafe. Similarly, lack, while it comes into the world through human beings, is an objective phenomenon. So what's the structure of lack? What does it mean for something to lack things? Well, it's essentially got three components for Sartre. If we think about something like the Venus de Milo, the statue of Venus with the missing arms, then we can see the three components quite clearly. So what Sartre calls the lacking, the existing, and the totality are the three components of lack. So in the case of the statue, what's lacking are the two arms of the statue, obviously. Now, that which is existing is the statue in its present incomplete state. And what makes the lack possible is that these two moments are conjoined in the form of the totality, which is the object with the lack. So, in order for the statue to lack arms, we have to have both the missing arms as the lack, the statue with the arms missing, the thing that's lacking something, and the totality that puts them together. We need those three moments. Lack, therefore, has a structure that on the one hand emerges from the in itself, which is the statue without any arms, but it also surpasses the in itself towards a larger unity. In itself, we simply have a block of matter. But in order to lack the arms, the statue needs to be conceived of as a totality with parts missing, and that requires consciousness. Now, this idea of lack is very much like the structure of consciousness itself. So as we've seen for Sartre, consciousness isn't a self-enclosed thing as it is for Descartes. Rather, consciousness is a directedness towards objects in the world. So just as the lack in the case of the Venus de Milo can only exist in the situation, the remainder of the statue, so consciousness as a negation can only exist in relation to the in itself. So in fact, as we've just been discussing, one way of understanding the for itself is as a rejection of the in itself. Consciousness is a rejection of the in itself that is precisely what allows consciousness the space to be in relation to it. So we can note further that for Sartre, consciousness comes into being through the attempt of being in itself to escape from its own contingency. So consciousness is supposed to provide an absolute foundation for being, but fails to do so through its own contingent nature. So the origin of the for itself already contains the notion of a lack through the failure of the for itself to fulfill its purpose. So this notion that the subject emerges from being in itself as an attempt to ground it, while at the same time failing to do so, is what gives rise to the emergence of value. So this whole structure of consciousness sort of erupting into the world brings with it value. Now Sartre gives two explanations on this point, and the first arises from the nature of desire, and the second from the structure of consciousness more generally. So I'll go through the first here, and we can talk about the second in the lecture, in the seminar if you want to. So this is the example of desire as the origin of value. So I'll go through this one then. So why does desire give us an origin of value? Well, Sartre's claim is that we don't lack something because we desire without being fulfilled. If that were the case, desire would be the same thing as lack. Rather, Sartre claims that it's because we're incomplete that we experience desire. So what we desire is to fill the emptiness of our being by transcending ourselves towards the world. So Sartre notes that if I'm writing a book, for instance, my desire to finish the book can't come from what I've already written, because each sentence is complete in itself. My desire to write is founded on the object that at present is not. Desire is this process of transcending what's present to what is not. In the process, value emerges as the positive value of what we're transcending towards, and as the negative value of what we're trying to move away from. Now, just to go through the other proof really quickly, Sartre argues similarly that because the structure of the for itself is the way it is, particular values come into the world. So being for itself is a failed project of founding the in itself. Now, as I said, it therefore has the structure of a lack. So the question is, what's the totality that would include being for itself and being in itself? Now, Sartre's claim is that such a totality is impossible, but that our idea of something that combines the self-identity of the in itself with the consciousness of the for itself would be God. So God is the conjunction of an absolute foundation with the freedom of consciousness. Now, the attempt to form this unity that overcomes our own lack is for Sartre the origin of value. So it's the fact that we're not this being in the form of a lack that gives meaning to our projects. Our actions in the world are therefore an attempt, in a sense, to reunite with being in itself, and therefore to become God. What we attempt to do, because we're a lack, is to fulfill absences in the world, and in doing so we attempt to reunite consciousness with plenitude, which is an attempt to become God. Now, as we're always situated in relation to particular being in itself, then our values emerge through this process as particular values. Okay, so value therefore emerges naturally from the structure of being for itself as an attempt to ground being in itself, a failed attempt to ground being in itself. Okay, so the last structure I want to talk about today of the for itself is possibility. Now, Sartre's claim is that just like lack and just like value, possibility emerges with the for itself. So on the one hand, Sartre claims that traditional metaphysical ideas on the nature of possibility are inappropriate because they fail to take account of the real nature of possibility. So, for instance, for Leibniz, something is taken to be possible if its nature isn't contradictory. So for Leibniz, a square circle is not possible, but it is possible for Adam not to have eaten the apple in the Garden of Eden. Ultimately, for Leibniz, that conception rests on whether an idea could be an idea of God. So possibility is a structure of knowledge, it's not a real structure. For Spinoza, though, similarly, everything is determined, and possibility is simply a state of ignorance of the causally determined sequence of the world. So in opposition to both these characterizations, the Leibnizian characterization of possibility as knowledge and the Spinozistic characterization of knowledge as ignorance, Sartre argues that possibility is a real structure of the world itself. So here's what he says. But this represented being of the possible cannot account for its nature. On the contrary, it destroys its nature. In the everyday use which we make of the possible, we can in no way apprehend it either as an aspect of our ignorance or as a non-contradictory structure belonging to a world not realised and at the margin of this world. The possible appears to us as the property of things, or beings rather. After glancing at the sky, I state, it is possible that it may rain. I do not understand possible here as meaning without contradiction with the present state of the sky. This possibility belongs to the clouds as a threat. The sky is a threat, rather. It represents a surpassing on the part of these clouds, which I perceive towards rain. The clouds carry this surpassing within themselves, which means not that the surpassing will be realised, but only that the structure of being of the cloud is a transcendence towards the rain. The possibility here is given as belonging to a particular being for which it is a power. This fact is sufficiently indicated by the way in which we say indifferently of a friend for whom we are waiting, it is possible that he may come, or he can come. Thus, the possibility cannot be reduced to a subjective reality. Neither is it prior to the real or to the true. It is a concrete property of already existing realities. So just as with nothingness, therefore, possibility is on the one hand not subjective, but is a real feature of the world. It's nonetheless a structure that only emerges with the emergence of the subject. So being in itself simply is what it is and cannot be otherwise. But because of this gap in consciousness, we find structures like lack, value, and possibility emerging in the world. So to conclude, therefore, the central element of Sartre's philosophy is this inability of consciousness to coincide with itself. So it's due to this failure, really, that we're thrown out into the world in the first place. And it's because of its tacit recognition of this failure that consciousness is driven to attempt to identify itself with itself through its projects. Okay, so that's all I want to talk about on this topic. Next week we'll go on and we'll talk about something that has hardly come up at all so far, which is our relationship with other people. Now, as we'll see, a lot of the content we've been looking at so far and a lot of the themes will play out in this account of our relationships with others. And we'll find that there's similarly a lack of coincidence with other people as there is with ourselves that really drives the kind of the ethical aspects of Sartre's thought. Okay, thanks a lot.